Imagine a world where you don't need a mobile phone, because information just appears contextually in front of you exactly when you need it. When language is automatically translated as you speak to a person, so you can just read them as subtitles. And as you navigate cities, you can see arrows appearing on the street, directing you to your ideal destination. In a world like this, you would describe technology as ambient, always there, always present, but rarely in the way. Last week, Mark Zuckerberg released the Ray-Ban Meta glasses. The technology itself actually flopped on stage, but regardless of the failed demos, I think they represent potentially a look into the future of human-machine interaction. In today's episode, I'm going to investigate whether or not we're at one of those inflection points. This is In the Loop with Jack Horton. I hope you enjoy the show. So let's start with what actually happened in last week's announcements. So on September 17th, last week, the Meta Connect event, which is like Meta's biggest event of the year, Mark Zuckerberg basically took the stage to announce what he believes the ideal form of superintelligence, because they actually announced the Ray-Ban glasses, starting at about $800 and coming out at the end of this month. Every single pair comes with this Meta neural band, which is this really innovative piece of technology that they themselves have produced, which uses electromyography, which is this technology that essentially reads the electrical signals in your hand. So little movements with your fingers or your wrist can obviously result in you taking action with the glasses. And to be honest, the product's actually quite impressive on paper. We're looking at a full color, high resolution HUD display, so heads-up display, positioned just off the side of your field of vision in the glasses. And the display covers about a 20-degree field of view. What I found also really impressive, actually, was the fact that the display cranks out about 5,000 nits of brightness. And obviously nits is a word that most people are not that familiar with, but to put it in perspective, most smartphone screens max out at about 800 to 1,200 nits. And even the brightest tablets rarely exceed 1,600. So this means that you can actually see the display very clearly in direct sunlight, which obviously, being a pair of glasses, is something really important, and previously has completely plagued all, smart glasses projects. It's also got a 12 megapixel camera and can record at 1080p, which is kind of crazy. It's also got microphone technology called beamforming, which is essentially the microphone being able to focus on sound that's coming from in front of you and focusing in on that, as well as open-ear speakers, and it weighs about 69 grams, which is the weight of a chicken egg, but still about 17 grams heavier than the previous generation because it didn't have a screen in the previous generation. So yeah, I think it's quite interesting, and though it's worth noting that obviously during the demo it was a bit of a flop because there was two high-profile attempts to showcase some of the most innovative features and it didn't work. I'm quite interested. A little side note, I think it's interesting that the demo is actually going wrong. The first attempt was a cooking influencer on stage, obviously in front of this big audience, who tried to use the glasses for recipe help. And he clearly said, hey Meta, start live AI. Now what was meant to happen is that the glasses start speaking out loud and having step-by-step instructions appear on the screen. But instead, the glasses kind of lagged out for a few awkward seconds and then suddenly jumped ahead and skipped the recipe. So obviously it didn't really work very well. And he had to kind of stop mid-demo and blame it on the Wi-Fi. And then it happened again with Mark Zuckerberg. He actually tried to take a WhatsApp call during the event from apparently the CTO. And basically, as you can imagine, it didn't connect. Mark Zuckerberg was visibly fumbling and trying to press different buttons to try and make this work, and eventually gave up. And I feel for them there. I do a lot of demos at Mindset. You can literally have a product work 1,000,000 times when you're practicing, and then in front of a live group of people, it can go wrong. It does happen now and again. They released an update within kind of 48 hours, and all the bugs were fixed. And the problems were quite reasonable as well. But either way, I thought it was quite an interesting side note because, gosh, that must have been awkward. Anyway, let's dig into what the glasses actually do, and I guess the use cases for these that are quite interesting to me. So first and foremost, you've got live captions and translations. It feels like 2025 is the year of live translation because I don't know if people have seen it, but Apple AirPods just released this new feature in their, I think it's their Gen 3 or Gen 4 AirPods, but instead obviously just being sound. And the reason it's worth noting is because it's a standout, I guess, capability that gets most early adopters quite excited. I mean, I'm probably in that category. I don't think I'd buy the Meta Ray-Ban glasses for just that feature, but it is really cool. So the glasses can listen to anyone that's speaking to you and display, I guess, captions just as they're speaking. And even more impressively, they can translate between languages just on the fly. Just imagine, going to Spain or wherever else you're going traveling in the world and just speaking to anybody and having those subtitles appear. That's really cool. And for accessibility, this could be huge. Imagine someone that might be hard of hearing or deaf, or someone that's got that's hard of sight, and be able to have someone or the AI read out what people are saying real time or have subtitles appear underneath them. So yeah, it's a really great feature for accessibility too. And early testers apparently have reported that it works quite well in quiet environments, though it can apparently struggle when there's lots of noise going on. It can accidentally sort of pick up stray words from nearby conversations. And I guess it's probably quite a similar experience to anyone that uses digital note-taker apps during video calls. Sometimes it gets muddled up between two people speaking and it labeling it as the same person speaking. Still, even with some issues, I think it's going to be a really exciting feature and has real use cases in the world. Second, you've got navigation and maps. I'm actually just really, I've always thought this is very cool. This idea where you can just be walking around a street and seeing arrows appear, or just general guidance that isn't in a map, and you have to have your head down inside a phone to see where you're going. And at the moment, there's some limitations to this. The glasses do provide a kind of turn-by-turn walking directions with arrows and mini-maps appearing on the glasses themselves, so in your peripheral vision. So yeah, I think although it's still in a map and it's not placing arrows onto the street as I was describing, it'll probably get there eventually. And I like the idea of not having to look at your phone as you're kind of navigating environments and just having it in your glasses instead. I think the way they've implemented it is quite interesting as well. The display is positioned so it doesn't block your entire central vision. It's more like kind of having a GPS overlay, in the corner of your eye. And at 5,000 nits of brightness, as I said, about 4 times brighter than a mobile phone, you can therefore see it in direct sunlight. And they're built in some security and safety measures, such as if you're moving at high speed, it's going to try and stop you using the feature. Or if you're, biking or driving, it's going to try and stop you doing it. The only real big problem I see right now is the fact that they don't support Google Maps or others. And we just know that those technology providers are so far ahead in the map space compared to, let's say, Meta, because Google has so much traffic information that's up to date and route updates and things like that. So the third use case that's quite interesting to me is message triaging and general communication. So the neural band comes into effect here because incoming texts or calls or app notifications can just appear in your lens, and you can just respond without reacting or looking at your phone. So you can use the neural band, you can kind of pinch your fingers a little bit or make subtle wrist movements to select an option or reply to a message and things like that. And what's quite surprising here is Marquise Brown. So for those that don't know him, he's the biggest YouTube tech reviewer in the world. He has the power to make or break a product launch, really. And he actually said it works really, really well. And he did a big in-depth review of it. I'd recommend go check that out. So yeah, for a lot of people online are saying it's genuinely useful. And even people describing it as kind of magical experiences here. Now, for me personally, I would never, ever, ever, ever in a million years allow notifications and texts and things like that appear on my screen in front of my eyesight. I have all notifications turned off. I don't like it being super intrusive and dragging me back to applications, but I know many people will love that. Then we come into the last use case that are really interesting, which is content creation. Obviously, Meta, a giant network of creators, the incentive for those creators to create content and be pushed by Meta on their applications also makes sense. And they've upgraded it to enable that use case really well. So they've got, as I said, 12 megapixel camera and 1080p filming. The camera also shows you where and what is being filmed. Because previous glasses, actually, you couldn't really tell if the camera was focusing on one thing over another. You can also zoom in just by rotating your wrist, like turning a dial, and start recording with kind of finger movements, which I also think is pretty cool. There's also an LED light that kind of flicks up on the glasses to activate when recording, so you actually are able to notify people around you that you're recording. Again, there's a lot of privacy fears and concerns with these glasses, and say being at the gym or doing things, and suddenly you're being filmed without you knowing it. And as you can imagine, you can film things like reels and stuff straight to the application and do live streaming and stuff like that. So that's all the things it can do, but importantly, I guess the question is will this be successful, or is it going to be another flop? Well, I'm going to try and attempt to answer that and give my viewpoint. So when this technology typically comes out, it's often seen as a bit fanciful by many people. Like, people eye roll, they don't think it'll ever catch on. And I think the smartphone evolution over time offers us probably the clearest roadmap to understand whether or not these smart glasses can actually catch on and, importantly, cross the chasm from, say, early adopters that really like, very niche features to the mainstream. So with that context in mind, in the early 2000s, mobile phones like, the BlackBerry 957, the Palm Trio, very early Nokias were incredibly popular for email and very basic web access, but appealed mainly to business users and very early adopters. And that's what they were often marketed as. They had very clunky interfaces, lots of big keyboards, very poor battery life, and in general, the public saw them as an expensive tool for business people or tech lovers. Now, obviously, as everybody knows, the inflection point came around 2007, 2010 with the iPhone and the Android, mainly the Android. And obviously, several factors aligned into what became literally a generational product. We had improved hardware, much faster chips, so things could run faster and the phone could be much more lightweight. We had new touchscreens that replaced, styluses and big keyboards. And very famously, the BlackBerry CEO said no one will ever want to use anything other than a keyboard. And you could argue that the smart glasses right now are in that BlackBerry era right now, because Meta sold about 2 million Ray-Ban glasses since about 2023, which is actually quite respectable for what is actually a new category. But it's very small compared to that $1.5 billion smartphone user, because that market is huge. So it almost mirrors how maybe a few million people were using PDAs and things like that before the iPhone changed everything. Zuckerberg himself actually referenced this third generation rule, which is where breakthrough consumer electronics typically hit their stride in the third iteration, selling between 5 and 10 million units if it's going to be destined for mass success. And I think Ray-Ban display represents Meta's third attempt. They had Stories in 2021, they had the Meta glasses launched in 2023, and now the display glasses in 2025. And so you could argue that this is their iPhone 3GS moment, where the technology might finally mature and achieve somewhat broader adoption. But there's also another possibility, which is they're actually in the year 2000, not 2007. And maybe the core infrastructure isn't here, social barriers are too high, you need many more iterations of hardware before it actually makes sense for a regular consumer. Or it might never catch on anyway. So with that in mind, let's go through some of the things that I think are going to make or break the smart glasses. So the first one, as you can imagine, is the price. It's about $800, which is quite actually respectable for an early adopter market. The first iPhone launched at about $600, which is about $850 today after inflation. And that very much positions it at the early adopter market. So it's slightly a bit too expensive for the mass consumers, but it's also not too expensive, which is where Apple Vision Pros landed at $3,500. I put myself in broadly an early adopter. I would never pay $3,500 for the Apple Vision Pro, even if I really wanted to try it. And historical precedent suggests that this pricing could work quite well. And importantly, Verizon is exploring whether to stock these glasses. They actually announced that they will be, but whether or not they do what they did with early mobile phones, which is, bundle it into packages that makes it a lot more affordable, or, for example, giving you some smart glasses when you get a specific type of contract. Because if they did that, that pricing would massively expand the total potential market for these glasses. The second factor, I think, is going to be the input mechanism. And when I say input mechanism, the way you interact with the smart glasses. Because obviously a lot of the smartphone innovations really hinged on how people could engage and interact with the phone. So you went from, T9 keyboards to QWERTY BlackBerry keyboards to then a touchscreen. And every breakthrough led to huge numbers of new use cases being possible. And I think the neural bands, you could argue, is potentially equivalent as that touchscreen. Meta have invested 4 years into building this out, and reviewers have described it as feeling quite magical. The ability to zoom in to cameras by rotating your wrist, or navigate interfaces through sort of like small gestures is really cool. And obviously, the better it gets, the more likely people will use it. But it's a really hard one to call. Anyway, factor 3 I would go into as the App Store. The iPhone was really powerful at launch, but it became like breakout successful through the App Store. Meta's glasses launched with essentially no third-party ecosystem and no ability for developers to build into it either. So that's going to be a problem. Now, Meta obviously understand intimately platform dynamics. That is literally their business model. And they're building developer interest gradually. So they've got partners like Microsoft, Disney, and many, many more. Number 4, obviously, is social acceptance. Early mobile phone users were seen as rude. Like, people talking loudly in public would get an eye roll. And over time, of course, as we've seen at scale, these norms do shift. Now, everyone is very happy staring at their screen in public. And I think smart glasses are going to have to overcome something quite similar. And there's going to be unique privacy fears and concerns to deal with as well. Meta learned quite well from Google Glasses and the giant failure that was Google Glasses anyway. So they've gone for trying to style their glasses in line with Ray-Ban. So that's why the partnership exists, to provide that, I guess, social legitimacy that pure tech companies just can't match. And the glasses also include a very bright LED screen when recording. So again, trying to tell everyone around that these cameras are now recording right now. However, even with this LED system, if venues and important public spaces start to ban these glasses, like schools, gyms, offices, hospitals, then it's just limiting all the potential times and places that these glasses can be used. And if all these areas become no glasses zone, then it's going to be hard to become a mainstream product. And then finally, as competition, obviously Apple is going to develop something similar. And they always launch something a few years late as well. And obviously they've got probably the most perfect position to produce something good here because it's Apple. I think they've lost a bit of that magic over the years, but I'm sure they can pull something good out the bag. And Meta really need this giant developer market share before Apple enters. Because, although Meta have that first mover advantage and it's building its ecosystem, Apple already have that built ready for them. It's going to be whether Meta can really hit that ambitious number of 10 million units sold by 2026. And if it can do that, maybe it can establish itself as a real player. So yeah, Meta Ray-Ban display represents either the dawn of, AR computing, or an expensive reminder that being early and first to market often means being wrong on timing. And I guess the technology obviously largely works. The use cases make sense. The social barriers are probably lower than ever before, especially with their partnership with Ray-Ban. But Meta do face huge challenges, like how are you going to build up a big enough developer ecosystem? How are you going to bring in the right big players like Apple and bringing iMessage in? And the big question of whether people really want computers on their face. So right now, I'd probably put us in the BlackBerry era of smart glasses. So it's finally functional enough for some utility amongst early adopters, but probably still years away from an iPhone moment that drives mass adoption. And the question really is whether Meta can iterate fast enough to get there, or whether they're really just building brand and awareness or a bridge for Apple to walk over. My verdict then is I'm cautiously optimistic. These might not change everything, but they could prove that change is quite inevitable. And sometimes being early to an inevitable change is enough. Anyway, thank you for listening. I hope you found today's episode interesting, and I'll see you next week.